Professor David Lindenmeyer will be speaking up next. Not only does he write books, not quite sure how he gets the time for all of this, but he's considered the leading conservation and biodiversity expert in Australia. He's been honoured with an Officer of the Order of Australia for his contribution to science. Throughout his career, he's published 48 books and over 800 peer-reviewed articles which have appeared in journals, scientific journals. So David will speak with us today on the impact of changing fire regimes on our forests and the biodiversity of those forests and options for the future. So please join me in welcoming Professor David Lindenmeyer to the show.
Thank you very much. My left hemisphere is about farms and biodiversity on farms. My right hemisphere is about forests and fires and other things. So today we're going to have a right hemisphere talk, and maybe some other time we can have a left hemisphere talk. So bear with me while we talk about fires. So a key thing about this is that there are many new aspects to what we're finding out about fire and fire regimes. Some of it is very confronting and some of it is quite controversial. I was always told that when you give an address at a conference, you should be quite provocative. The reality here is that the provocative nature of what we're going to talk about is actually deeply embedded in recent science. So let's move into that. So what I wanted to do was to go through a series of topics about ecosystems before the fire and how that influences how severe the fire is, how the system recovers after fire, and then talk about how what we're doing to the landscape actually influences the fire itself. And this is very controversial, but it is now starting to be added to with more and more data showing that the way that we treat our forest landscapes actually influences the fire quite dramatically. Then I wanted to talk about what's happening after the fire. And this is really important because many of the lenses that we see fire through are based on a single fire event. For example, black summer fires. But often we need to think about multiple fires in succession, what we call the fire regime, because that is a really important influence on how our ecosystems are travelling. Then what's really important is that what happens before the fire actually influences the fire itself through what we call an interaction. And I'll just talk a little bit about that because it's quite profound in terms of what's happening. So many of our ecosystems now have to deal with not only fire and, for example, logging, but a combination of both in an interacting way. And that has really profound impacts for how we're travelling. Then I want to talk a little bit more about what happens after the fire and then finish with some implications for how we're going to manage what are increasingly flammable ecosystems. Okay, so I have a diagram of our large-scale long-term studies. So our group really specialises in these very long-term studies because they're the ones that tell us about how systems are changing through time, especially in a place like Australia, which is hyper-variable. So if I'm looking a little bit dusty this morning, it's because I've just come from our Jarvis Bay fire study, where we're doing long-term bird plots and fire and beetle bush control. That work's been going for nearly 20 years. So this time of the year, we started about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning counting birds. And following that, after 6 to 8 plots in the morning, I was in the car on the way to Cayenne. So some background. One of the key drivers of fire is climate and weather. And they're different things. Weather is short-term fluctuations. Climate is long-term change. So really what's important here is the background levels of CO2 in the atmosphere because there's a very strong link between CO2 in the atmosphere and temperature. And we see that our background levels of CO2 were, for about the last 800,000 years, somewhere in the range of about 280 parts per million. This last month, we were sitting on 419. And we know that there's a strong link between hot, dry, and CO2 in the atmosphere. And the IPCC says that we're going to be at about 1.5 by 2030. We're already at about 1.2, 1.3. So how does that relate to fire? Well, what we see is there's a very substantial change in what we call the Forest Fire Danger Index. So since I was born, the number of these days has gone up 10 times. So that's the last 60 years. And we need to think about this in terms of data. And there's a place in Hawaii that measures CO2 in the atmosphere. It's called the Keeling curve. And you can see that there's little fluctuations that take place each season with the productivity of the landscape, but the curve shape's pretty clear in terms of where CO2 is going. Okay, so just think about that the next time that you're watching Sky News and they're talking about no evidence. And there's actually been a meta-analysis of the relationship between climate and fire. And there's 57 different studies, and the evidence is overwhelming. Despite what, for example, Malcolm Roberts might say in the Senate, the evidence is actually overwhelming. So I rest his case. Let's now move to before the fire. And this is one of my favourite photographs taken by somebody else. And there's a picture of yours truly in the mountain ash forests of the Central Highlands of Victoria at our long-term site 470. These are the tallest flowering plants on the planet. And we've been working in these forests since July 1983. So I suppose I'm standing before you disguised as a much older man. But we continue to learn fantastic things about these amazing forests. So one of the things that's really important is the relationship between the age of the forest and the severity of fire. And we know that fire severity is always lower in old forests. Okay, so you need to know the difference between severity, which is how much the vegetation is burnt back, relative to intensity, which is the amount of heat that's given off. So fire severity is always lower in old forests. Animals are much more likely to persist in an old forest at the time that it's burnt than if it's a young forest that's burnt. The recolonisation rate, both of plants and animals, is much faster and earlier when it's an old forest that's burnt. And that recovery is much faster, for example, the amount of seed germination. Okay, so just as a little aside, there's a politician in Victoria that says that we never publish peer-reviewed papers. So at the bottom of almost each slide, we just indicate that what we're talking about here is actually based in peer-reviewed science, just to counter some of that stuff. We know on the other side of the ledger, younger forests always burn at higher severity than old forests. So the severity is strongly linked to the age. We know that there are what we call fewer biological legacies. So these are the big living and dead trees that are burned in a fire, the understory components, the seeds, other things. And we know that recovery is much slower. Okay, so this is really important to think about what is being burnt at the time of a fire and how that influences what's going on. Okay, now we're going to start to get into some of the provocative bits. So we know that there's actually quite a strong relationship between how severe a fire is and its logging history. And the shape of the curve is what we call non-linear. So what happens in the early phases of a forest development, so this is the age of the forest down here, there's a very low chance of a high severity fire. And then after about 10 years, the probability of high severity fire actually increases almost 7 times and remains at a very flammable state for about the next 40 years before the curve shape starts to bend back down here. So this is based on data from the 2009 fires in Victoria. And what you can do is you can decompose that information to look at what was logged versus what's unlogged. And you can see what's going on with the curve shape here. So essentially what happens is that it's not until a forest reaches about 80 to 90 years that the fire severity starts to subside. And so we've actually got this very long memory or lag time in the system as a consequence of what we did many decades ago. Okay, now this is controversial. So what happens then is that people from the industry say, well, actually there's no relationship between logging and fire, so there's nothing to worry about. So this was a paper in 2014 in response to ours. And what actually happens when you plot their data is that you start to see something like this happening, which is very similar to what we found. And then you read the paper And the paper is entitled "Timber Harvesting Does Not Increase Fire Risk and Severity." And then in the paper itself, it says there was an apparent increase in the severity of ground fire. So my little old mum always said to me, David, never judge a book by its cover. And I think you should never judge the title of a paper based on what its content says. You actually need to read it. And this is really quite important because a title like that is extremely misleading. And most people actually never read papers. They look at the titles or they read the abstracts. They actually never read deeply into what's happening. So we actually looked at the Black Summer fires in terms of fire severity, and the only thing to really take away from that is the curve shape. Again, this is a different fire, the Black Summer fires, the age of the forest, and the probability of crown burn. That distinct left skewed shape of the curve is really quite important in this context. So we then analysed the entire fire footprint, all 4 million data points for the 2019-2020 fires. And what we discovered is this. We have 3 kinds of forest fire danger index here. So this is fairly benign in the green. This is moderate forest fire danger index here, and this is extreme. And so there are 3 or 4 things to take from this set of data. The first one is that forests always burn in log forests, harvested forests, always burn at higher severity than intact forest. Okay, so, and it doesn't matter whether it's a low forest fire danger index or moderate or high. And this occurs right across Victoria, southern New South Wales, and northern New South Wales. But the second thing that's really important, the takeaway, so the log forest is always burning at higher severity, irrespective of fire weather. But the real kicker here is that a log forest burning under moderate fire severity still burns at higher severity than an intact forest burning under extreme conditions. Okay, so that's quite a sobering outcome, and it's a non-trivial data analysis to look at the entire fire footprint. But in some cases, the difference here are really quite substantial. So this is nearly a 20% difference in the change in forest fire severity. Okay, now, if it was just us that was finding these kinds of results, then maybe there would be a concern. But in more recent times, fire researchers from the University of Wollongong are finding very similar things. So I've got just a little statement from their abstract. I did read the whole paper as well as the title and the abstract. And from the abstract, fuel was available to burn 1.4 times more often in recently logged sites compared to those that have been unlogged. Look at the time here. So we found that lag effect for 40 years. These people are finding 70 years. So that means that something that was logged in the 1950s has still got that fire risk added to it. And we can see other statements here. Logging and to a lesser extent wildfire increase the risk of fire. Now we're going to come back to this in a moment because this is a really profound statement that actually coincides with what we're finding in southwest West Australia. Okay, so let's now think about the mechanisms. Why would a log forest be more likely to burn at high severity? And the first one is that there's an enormous amount of debris that's left over. About 60% of the biomass. You can actually see, this is a log forest in Victoria, you can actually see down to the middle of Melbourne there. So there's an enormous amount of extra fuel that's added to the forest when it's logged. The other thing that happens is that the ground layer is dried out, and quite profoundly, often for up to 8 decades. We can, I can send you any of the papers that if you want to read about this stuff. There's a lot less tree ferns in the system. Nearly 96% knockdown in the number of tree ferns. The architecture of the forest has changed from being a more variable, heterogeneous forest structure to one which is a densely uniform system. We have a lot more young, flammable plants in the system, and we see that the microclimate of young forests is actually much warmer and much more variable than an older forest. And we know that these lag times are 40 to 70 years, depending on who's been looking at which data sets. Now, the thing that's really interesting here is that in fact, some of the fire authorities already know this. So we can see this is a map from the Currowan fire. Probably remember the terrible Currowan fire not so far from here. Fire safety issue, high fuel loads, forestry slash. So this is the map that the Rural Fire Service had issued to their volunteers, which was then sent to us saying, you know, they're aware that there's a problem. So I think quite important. So one of the responses to this is the industry is saying, well, we'll solve the problem. What we'll do is we'll go and thin the forest and we'll all live happily ever after. So our response is, okay, let's look at the data. We look at the data of thin forest versus unthin forest after the 2009 fires in Victoria, and the thin forest versus unthin forest after the Black Summer fires. And the answer is, generally there's not much of an effect, except in some cases where it makes it worse. So thinning is not going to solve the problem, sadly. And these kinds of questions are actually stimulated by being in forests and being outside in these environments and thinking about questions in relation to how the forest dynamics work. Okay, now let's change to after the fire. Okay, so we've seen how climate's important. We've seen how the forest has treated that influence the severity of the fire. Let's now look at things that are happening after fire. And one of the things that we've done is look at what happened after the Black Summer fires and put this into context in southeastern Australia. So this is a very sobering graph. This is the prevalence of large fires, and so we're looking at the area of the forest that's burned here, and we're looking at the 5-year cohorts here. And what we can see is that since 2003, we've had 3 fires that exceed 1 million hectares, which is what's defined as a mega fire. So there was a mega fire in 1939, that was one for the previous century, and there was a mega fire in the preceding century, the 1800s. So we had one in each of those centuries, and we've had 3 in the 17 years or 20 years since this century's really kicked off. So that tells you that things are changing, and we're going to have to think deeply about what's going on. But remember, we talked about this issue of fire regime. So this is a sequence of fires over time. That's when we really got to think about what's going on. So this is northeastern Victoria in particular. And what we see here is the number of fires taking place. And we see that there are areas that are now burning up to 4 times. This is in the last 25 years. Now, the normal fire regime would be, on average, every 75 years for a major high severity fire. So we're seeing places that are burning 3 or 4 times in 25 years instead of once in 75 years. And this has really big implications for a whole range of things, including the ability of ecosystems to rebound after they've been disturbed. And we see it in other metrics which are really, really deep concern. Victoria's lost over 3/4 of its old growth forest since 1995 as a consequence of repeated fires and logging. So some summary points from that. We see that there's a really big increase in the amount of forest that's burning, and some areas are burning very frequently, far too frequently. But even if you didn't care about those things and you are only interested in timber production, what's actually happening is that large areas of forest that were slated for logging in the future are actually being burnt. So this is happening in East Gippsland, but it's also occurring in southeastern New South Wales. In fact, it's even more profound in southeastern New South Wales than it is in northeastern Victoria. So East Gippsland, which is the biggest forest management area in Victoria, lost about 60% of everything that it planned to cut in the next 5 years under its timber release plan in the Black Summer fires. And statewide, that was 1/3, 30%. So what's really happening here is that fire's competing with forestry for access to timber and fire's winning. And part of the reason it's winning is that when we cut a forest, we make it more flammable, which means it's more likely to reburn and then compete for that forest resource. Pretty sobering stuff. Okay, so let's now look at another aspect of after the fire. So the frequency of fire and the severity of fire are key parts of what we call the fire regime. The patchiness of fire is another part of a fire regime. And so we've looked at what happened after the Black Summer fires. And we end up also with some rather sobering outcomes. Now, the patchiness of fire is really important because we know that many of those green areas within the fire footprint are where biodiversity will persist and help with the natural recolonisation process. And we know that when you have more green in the landscape, the speed of recovery is faster. We've seen that, for example, at Borderee National Park. What we see is that, yes, we know that the fire was very extensive in Black Summer. We found that only 10% of the area within the entire burn footprint actually remained undisturbed by the fire. And most of these areas are actually very small remaining patches, less than a hectare. And so what's really important is to think deeply about these refuges. So there's an enormous amount of effort at the moment talking about how much more prescribed burning that we've got to do after these fires. But in fact, those green refuges are actually really important if we want to hold on to animal and plant biodiversity. Those refuges are critical. And the last thing we need in many of those landscapes is yet more disturbance. Okay, now let's move to another aspect of the management of forests after fire. This is what we call post-fire logging impacts, or salvage logging. I think the term salvage logging is a misnomer because in many cases you're actually not really salvaging anything, you're actually impairing the recovery quite dramatically. So here's a slide from Victoria, and you can see the lone truffler tree in the landscape after the Black Saturday fires in 2009. And this is not atypical of what you see in a post-fire salvage logging operation. And it's essentially a triple disturbance. First of all, you have a very intense prolonged drought period. Then you have a major wildfire. And then you have a logging event soon after that wildfire on top of that. So many of the species actually have to deal with quite serious challenges from a combination of natural disturbances and human disturbances in concert. So what we have done is actually studied this, and we see that post-fire logging, salvage logging actually has a whole series of effects which are really quite remarkable in terms of their detrimental impacts. So we lose most of all the large old trees, and for many of our species in Australia, that's a disaster. Australia is really odd in the sense that we have such a high proportion of animals that are dependent on cavities, which is really quite a conundrum when you think that we don't have animals like woodpeckers that actually stimulate the development of cavities, yet we've got so many species, over 300, that are cavity dependent. The composition of the vegetation is dramatically altered. We lose a lot of the resprouting species. Things like musk daisy bushes, tree ferns are lost when we have that double disturbance. Big damage to the soil that lasted about 80 years. That was Elle Bowd's paper published in 2019. Big impacts on water yields, catchments, and very big impacts on a whole range of species. Plus there's an added fire risk problem. So here's a little bit of data published in 2018. Essentially we see that this species, the aptly named flame robin, actually does really well. It's the only species that does well in highly disturbed forests like this. And there's a whole range of other species, including things that are relatively common elsewhere that do very badly. Okay. And in the context of post-fire logging in this part of the world, where most of your tree species actually naturally resprout, that's a complete no-brainer. The system is recovering naturally. It does not need further disturbance. That will impair the recovery process. Okay, now we're coming to a little bit of fairly challenging science, but I think it's really important. So this is the interaction before and after the fire. So as we talked about before, in some of our wetter forest types, we should be seeing the average interval between fires to be somewhere between 75 to 150 years. These are for high severity fires in some of these wetter forests. It's even longer in gondwanak rainforests. But what we're seeing in many places, we're seeing up to 5 major fires in less than a century, and in some places 3 to 4 fires in the last 25 years. So what's going on in some of these landscapes? Well, what we're seeing is this. This is quite common in many parts of Victoria and southeast New South Wales. The white polygons are logging coops, and we can see the dates of those logging coops. I could take you to probably 50 or 60 vistas outside of Melbourne and you would see the same thing. And you see logging curve here, here. Here we have our lonely long-term monitoring site down here, AMU site 379 over here, where we measure how the landscape is changing and then look at how that's affecting biodiversity in the site that's not logged. So the landscape is now filling up with lots of young regenerating forest. And if we remember back just a few minutes ago, that young regenerating forest is actually very flammable. So what is happening is that we're continuing to push the age class structure of the forest to become younger and younger and younger, and increasing the extent of highly flammable forested system. And this is what we call a landscape trap. And what happens is that widespread logging and previous fire gives you young forest that's at increased risk of high severity fire, and that repeated fire continues to burn the forest before the forest can grow old enough to become mature and reduce the fire severity. And so this was a very controversial paper that was published in 2011. I got many hundreds of hate mails from this paper. And what actually happened after the 2019-20 fires is that what was a theoretical paper, this one, actually proved to be actually what was really going on. This was published just a few months ago, that now the landscape trap has actually been sprung. And if you go through large parts of Victorian Alps, you'll see extensive areas of alpine ash that look like this, for which we need to collect extensive amounts of seed to then try to artificially regenerate a forest that would have naturally regenerated on its own if you had a normal fire regime. And you can create a nice little picture of what's happening. This is a landscape trap system, which is very flammable. You get a fire, you salvage log it, then you have lots of young forest, which is very flammable, it reburns, and eventually if you have too much fire, these trees aren't old enough, they need to be about 30 years old to start producing viable seed. The system collapses and you end up with wattle thickets, which is actually what's happening. That's what will happen with this area of forest here if you don't artificially seed it. This is a normal fire regime. We have old forest, you have the system maturing, you have a fire which is lower severity, you get a mixed stage forest or some smaller areas of young forest, and that's how that system has managed itself for the last 20 million years. It's really only in the last 100 years that we started to get a big problem. Now I should say as a digression, these were not forests that were extensively culturally burned. These were wet forests where Aboriginal people moved through them and they did harvest things, but igniculture or cultural burning wasn't a big part of these systems. Otherwise they couldn't exist because of their response to fire. And interestingly, people from Tasmania are now finding the same thing in their Tasmanian forests. Fire risk decreases with stand development, as we've been saying before. Widespread logging and wildfire can increase landscape fire, consistent with the notion of a landscape trap. So, despite all the hate mails, essentially what we conceptualised was taking place after the 2009 fires and then wrote about recently is actually happening. So let's now shift to after the fire in terms of biodiversity and think about some of the responses. And we could do loads of lectures on this and I don't want to do that, but I just wanted to give a strong sense of how simplified the media coverage of fire often is relative to the true complexity of what actually happens. So some beasties actually persist. This animal is the mountain brush-tailed possum, and on the afternoon of the Black Saturday fires, we had 18 animals that were fitted with radio transmitters in an area that burnt at incredibly high severity. Every single one of those radio-collared animals survived, every one of them. And most of them actually survived long enough to be able to contribute to the next generations of mountain brush-tailed possums because you can see it in the genetic signal. And so this is Sam Banks who led this work, long-term work to show what's going on with this wonderful population of mountain brush-tailed possums. So this is the distant cousin of the one that eats your vegetables and your fruit. This is a deep, wet forest animal, and it does all sorts of wonderful things. We could talk about the life and times of the mountain brush-tailed possum. It makes young and restless look something pretty tame in comparison. Here we've got an animal that actually does really well after fire. This is the flame robin. And almost instantly after the 2019-20 fires, many of our long-term sites that were burnt filled up with these things. Who knows where they were coming from? And it's only now in the last year or two that we've started to see the curve bend back and the number of flame robins start to decline. Now this animal is really interesting because in our woodland studies, it's a winter resident, particularly replanted places, and then in the late spring and the summer, it's an altitudinal migrant that goes up in the mountains, including where these parts of the forest have been burnt. Now this is leadbeater's possum. This animal sends forest managers into apoplexy in Victoria. It just happens to live in the wet forests of Victoria, which is also sought after for making paper and wood chips. And it doesn't do very well in fires. A lot of animals are incinerated. But what we see is that this animal and another animal, the greater glider, actually continue to decline for prolonged periods after the fire. And what we know is that these animals are cavity tree dependent, and many of these trees are being lost quite rapidly after fire. Very few new trees are being recruited, and we see big declines of these species. So this is the trend curve for the greater glider. It's declined about 80% since 1997. And it's now extinct at Wooreen National Park, and it's been declining just about everywhere. Sadly, it's a species that's susceptible to fire, to logging, to land clearing and climate change. It eats eucalypt leaves, but only certain types. Logging changes the composition of the forest to produce junk food, which is not good for greater gliders. But also the change in fire regimes is terrible for this animal. And with increasing temperatures, it can't cope with what's happening to its environment. And again, there's good data on what's happened. This is a 25-year data set. We can see the greater gliders decline. We can see that leadbeater's possum is also declining. We see that with the amount of harvesting in the landscape, leadbeater's possum declines. But interestingly, a closely related gliding animal called the sugar glider, which is now Crefts glider, actually increases with the amount of harvest. It's a kind of weedy species that's pushing out leadbeater's possum. And the more we have fire in the landscape, animals like the greater glider here are declining. So this is why we collect long-term data sets to be able to see the changes in their species. And we have to publish this kind of information. So just this concept of peer review is really important in science. So if you're a politician, your peers are friendly to you and they send you to New York or to London. In the scientific fraternity, your peers are anonymous. They review your papers, and for most, it's a tough process. Almost every paper published in ecology has already been to 3 or 4 other journals before it finally finds a home. It's not an issue for the faint-hearted. So the concept of peers in politics and the concept of peers in science are quite different. Okay, so now we come to one of the most provocative bits of the talk, and the most recent. So this is some work not led by me, but I've been working with Phil Zylstra, who's connected with University of Wollongong. And this now brings us into the realm of other treatments of the land management, and this concept of hazard reduction burning or prescribed burning. So most people would be aware that hazard reduction burning is a planned burn in the non-wildfire season. Okay? And it's important to be aware that under extreme conditions, hazard reduction burning has limited effects. So for example, Canberra fires 2003, we didn't hazard reduction burn, we had horse paddocks that had nothing on them, and the fire still burnt across those at 70 kilometres an hour before it burned in Canberra. And this is not an unusual situation. This is Marysville, northeast of Melbourne. I gave a keynote address in Marysville in December 2008. You could not see in front of your face because of the amount of smoke in that town. In February 2009, this is what it looked like. So it's important to be aware of that. So when Alan Jones says, if only we had done more hazard reduction burning, none of this would have happened, I want you to think about about these kinds of things. And the Victorian government actually did the right thing in the Black Summer fires by indicating to people that the catastrophic conditions meant that it was very difficult to defend your place, and for safety reasons, it was probably right to be out of there. Okay, let's come back to that. So the key issue here then is fire weather. At the time that the fire is burning, has a really big effect on what's happening to the forest and how severe the fire is. But we'll come to this in a moment. Other factors are important. So this is Phil Zylstra's paper about self-thinning of forests after disturbance. And so some of his key findings are really quite profound. So this is for southwest Western Australia. So prescribed burns are working for about 5 to 7 years in terms of dampening fire severity. Okay? Then you have a significant increase in the risk of high severity fire that lasts for about 4 to 5 decades after that. So you see some similarities then between what we were talking about previously with cutting the forest, logging the forest, and then regenerating the forest, and then having that elevated fire severity for a number of years. We actually see the same thing happening in prescribed burnt forests. And what Phil's found is that those affected forests are likely 7 times more likely to burn than the old forests. So one of the key lessons from all of this work is actually what we're really missing in the landscape is more extensive areas of old forest. And under the most extreme climate conditions, the older forests are 3 times less likely to burn than recently prescribed burn forests. So this is really quite profound in what Phil's been finding. And he's just completed another analysis. I'm not part of that, but he is. And they're finding very similar kinds of things. And so what's really happening here is we've got to think about targeting our burning where it matters. And some work that was led by a colleague of mine, Phil Gibbons, showed that prescribed burning is important when it's done close and when it's done frequently, just as Phil Zylstra just showed. And so you need to think about where you're doing your hazard reduction burning. If we're going to be burning in far remote parts of Kosciuszko National Park and other places, it has very little effect on protecting people and property, which is what we should be doing with that. We need to maintain refuges that don't have any fire, given how rare they are, given the extent of wildfires. And we need these long unburned areas because they're critical for plant and animal biodiversity. So this is Phil Gibbons' paper on house loss, looking at actual data after what happened after 2009 fires. And yes, prescribed burning had an effect, was relatively small, and it disappeared under extreme conditions. Okay, some other management issues. The other thing is that we've got to grow a lot more old forest. That's where the fire severity is lowest. And we've got to think about the factors that are contributing to flammability, such as logging and in some cases hazard reduction burning. And we've got to move away from this notion of salvage logging, given the impacts that it has. And we have to watch out for these multiple high severity fires, not only in terms of what they're doing to the fire regime itself, but also what it does to the ecosystems. So what are we going to do about this highly flammable forest? This has been exercising our minds for a long time at ANU, and we've started to think about this in terms of the role of new technologies and its link to the science that we've been doing. So Martin Yebra has been leading this, and essentially what you want to do is you want to think about what are most of our emissions from. They're mostly lightning strikes, dry lightning strikes. You can model lightning strikes mathematically, and you can work out those areas that are most likely to lead from an ignition to a serious fire. So you can prioritise where you would do your fire suppression. So you can use drone fleets to detect ignitions. You can use lightning strike modelling to work out where you're likely to have a lightning strike, and you can use unmanned vehicles to drop payloads of water on an area the size of a normal house within minutes. So there are ways to use new technologies to help us with this, to suppress fires quickly, to detect them quickly, and to help us try to grow through forests to so that they're older and less flammable. So there are ways to tackle some of these problems with some of the technology, and of course to take out some of the factors that are contributing to fire severity and risk. So I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for your time. I hope that was.
If you enjoyed this presentation, then please subscribe to our channel. Other presentations from the conference are available in this playlist, with new ones being added all the time.